comparison between the 2020s and the late Roman Empire is not merely rhetorical or aesthetic. It reflects a deeper structural similarity in how civilizations behave when they reach a certain stage of maturity, complexity, and saturation. Rome in its late imperial phase was not simply collapsing in a dramatic sense. It was transforming, fragmenting, and reorganizing under pressures created by its own success. The empire had reached a point where its systems were vast, its institutions heavy, its populations diverse, and its identity diffuse. The 2020s exist in a similar civilizational condition. Global society has achieved unprecedented technological integration, economic interdependence, and cultural connectivity. But this expansion has also produced fragility, dislocation, and instability. In both periods, the core problem is not external invasion or single political failures, but systemic overload. Systems that were built for growth struggling to adapt complexity. Rome had conquered the Mediterranean world and integrated dozens of cultures, economies, and religions into a single imperial structure. The modern world has integrated the planet into a single digital, financial, informational, and logistical system. In both cases, scale becomes a liability. What once created strength now creates inertia. Governance becomes slower, legitimacy becomes thinner, and social cohesion becomes harder to maintain because the system is no longer intimate enough to feel human, yet too fast to feel accountable. One of the most striking parallels lies in the nature of authority itself. Late Roman power was still immense, but it had become increasingly abstract. The emperor was no longer a familiar political figure, but a distant symbol of order, law, and cosmic legitimacy. Power had shifted from personal leadership to bureaucratic machinery, ritualized hierarchy, and institutional performance. Authority became ceremonial rather than relational. In the 2020s, a similar phenomenon exists in modern governance and global institutions. Power is dispersed across governments, corporations, algorithms, regulatory bodies, international organizations, and financial systems that no single individual truly controls. Leadership becomes symbolic rather than decisive, managerial rather than visionary. Citizens experience power not as protection or representation, but as regulation, surveillance, administration, and abstraction. The state becomes an interface rather than a presence. This produces alienation. People feel governed but not guided, ruled but not represented. In late Rome, this alienation expressed itself through apathy, withdrawal, localism, religious retreat, and the rise of alternative identities that competed with imperial loyalty. In the 2020s, It expresses itself through political polarization, cultural fragmentation, radicalization, and the search for meaning in subcultures, ideologies, and online tribes. The structure is different, but the psychological condition is similar. A loss of faith in the coherence of the central order. Culturally, both eras exhibit a condition of saturation rather than creation. Late Roman culture did not lack art, philosophy, or architecture, but it increasingly recycled older forms. Classical ideals were preserved, imitated, codified, and institutionalized rather than reinvented. Innovation became administrative rather than imaginative. The empire preserved its past more than it created its future. In the 2020s, modern culture shows a similar pattern. Reboots, remakes, nostalgic cycles, algorithm-driven repetition, and recycled aesthetics dominate media, entertainment, and fashion. Cultural production becomes recursive rather than generative. This is not because creativity has disappeared, but because systems of distribution, monetization, and attention favor familiarity and blandness over risk and enterprise. Late Rome preserved the myths of its golden age. Modern society preserves the imagery of its recent cultural peaks. Both civilizations demonstrate what happens when a culture becomes self-referential. It begins to orbit in its own history, rather than imagine new horizons. This produces a feeling of temporal stagnation, where society moves technologically, but not spiritually. Economic, but not meaningful. Progress becomes mechanical rather than visionary. Economically, the late Roman world and the 2020s share a deep structural imbalance between wealth concentration and systemic stability. Late Rome saw increasing inequality, the consolidation of land into elite estates, the weakening of small producers, more burdensome, while corruption and patronage networks became normalized. The economy remained large, but its circulation became rigid. In the 2020s, global capitalism shows similar patterns. Wealth concentrates in financial institutions, corporations, and elite classes, while middle classes shrink and economic insecurity spreads. Debt replaces stability. Financialization replaces production. Economic participation becomes increasingly abstract, mediated through platforms, systems, and digital infrastructure rather than tangible labor. In both cases, economic life becomes detached from every human meaning. People no longer feel embedded in productive systems, they feel subjected to them. This creates resentment, disillusionment, and the sense that the system exists for itself rather than for the benefit of society. Religiously and spiritually, late Rome experienced not a decline of belief, but a transformation of belief. Traditional Roman religion weakened, not because most people became less spiritual, but because old forms no longer answered new existential conditions. Mystery cults, philosophical religions, and new spiritual movements emerged because people sought meaning in a world that felt unstable and impersonal. Faith became inward, personal, salvational, and identity-forming rather than civic and ritualistic. The 2020s reflect a parallel transformation. Traditional religious institutions decline in influence, but belief itself does not disappear. Instead, spirituality fragments into individualized belief systems, ideological identities, psychological frameworks, and quasi-religious political movements. Meaning migrates from temples to platforms, from theology to ideology, from liturgy to narrative. People do not become less spiritual, they become spiritually displaced. The search for meaning becomes chaotic, decentralized, and commodified. Late Rome saw the rise of new universal belief systems that transcended ethnicity and class. The modern world sees the rise of belief systems that transcend nationality and geography through digital connectivity. Both eras demonstrate that when old symbolic structures collapse, new ones emerge, not always peacefully, and not always coherently. The sense of civilizational exhaustion is another shared feature. Late Rome did not collapse suddenly. It slowly lost confidence in itself. It still had armies, cities, roads, laws, and institutions. But it no longer believed in its own permanence. Its future imagination weakened. The empire became defensive rather than expansive, preservational rather than aspirational. In the 2020s, modern civilization exhibits a similar psychological posture. The dominant narratives are not about utopian futures, but about crisis management, economic instability, political polarization, technological risk, and social fragmentation. The future is imagined as something to survive rather than something to build. This shift in imagination is crucial. Civilizations decline not when they lose power, but when they lose narrative coherence. Rome lost the story of why it existed. The modern world struggles to articulate a shared purpose beyond consumption, security, and continuity. Without a unifying civilizational story, societies fragment into competing micro-narratives that no longer align. Even the structure of identity mirrors late Roman conditions. Roman identity transformed from a clear cultural and civic belonging into a layered, abstract legal category. One could be Roman without being culturally Roman, geographically Roman, or even emotionally Roman. Identity became bureaucratic. In the modern world, identity is similarly abstracted. People belong to systems rather than communities, platforms rather than places, networks rather than neighborhoods. Belonging becomes symbolic rather than relational. This weakens social trust and cohesion. Society becomes populated but not connected, dense but not unified, large but not intimate. This creates psychological isolation even within mass society, a phenomenon late Roman writers also described in their own terms. What ultimately links the 2020s to the late Roman Empire is not a decline in a dramatic sense, but transition in a structural sense. Rome did not simply fall. it transformed into new political, cultural, and religious forms that shaped the medieval world. Its collapse was also a reconfiguration. The 2020s may represent a similar transitional era, where old systems of nationhood, economy, culture, identity, and authority are dissolving without new stable forms yet replacing them. This produces uncertainty, instability, and cultural anxiety. People sense that they are living between worlds, not fully inside the old order, not yet inside a new one. This liminal condition is deeply Roman in character. Late antiquity was an age between classical civilization and medieval civilization, between pagan cosmology and Christian cosmology, between imperial unity and regional fragmentation. The 2020s occupy a similar threshold between industrial modernity and digital postmodernity, between national sovereignty and global systems, between human-centered economies and algorithmic structures. The resemblance, therefore, is not about decadence, corruption, or moral decay. In a simplistic sense, it is about structural transformation under the weight of complexity. Both eras represent civilizations that have become too interconnected, too integrated, too vast to be governed by their original frameworks. Both systems show outgrowing their architectures. Both reveal the psychological effects of living inside large, impersonal structures that individuals no longer feel capable of influencing. And both demonstrate the collapse is often not an event, but a process, a long, slow reorganization of reality that feels like decline from within, but transformation from a historical distance. The late Roman Empire was not the end of civilization. It was the end of civilizational form. Likewise, the 2020s do not resemble Rome because modern society is falling apart, but because it is evolving beyond the structures that once defined it. The sense of crisis is not the sign of annihilation, but of transition. History suggests that periods are not gentle. They are unstable, confusing, and turbulent. But they are also generative. From Rome's transformation emerged new worlds, new identities, new systems of meaning, and new civilizations. The 2020s may represent a similar historical hinge point, a moment where the old world is no longer coherent, but the new world is not yet intelligible. In that sense, their resemblance to late Rome is not a prophecy of doom, but a recognition of historical rhythm. Civilizations do not end in fire. They dissolve into form, memory, myth, and transformation. This is why the comparison persists. Not because history is repeating itself mechanically, but because human systems follow patterns of growth, saturation, and complexity, and reorganization. The late Roman Empire and the 2020s are connected by structure, not circumstance, by psychology, not chronology, by systemic logic, not surface similarity. Both are ages of transition, fragmentation, and redefinition, and both exist at the edge of worlds.